Ihua Akarja, and welcome to another episode of the Serpentine Herald, a channel where we discuss some potential real-world inspirations for concepts and characters in video games. This is another episode in my Inanam on Nahar series, the Etymology of Souls, where we go through some of the potential origins of the names, places, and figures in the Dark Souls series through the lens of the culture, the folklore, and the language that I grew up around. So I've seen it talked about on the Dark Souls lore subreddit that the goddess Fina's name comes from the Irish Gwynevere, or Fina-Gwynevere, both are correct, who was a figure in Irish mythology. And today I want to discuss with you the concept of a sovereignty goddess, as well as Gwynevere, Fina, and their legacy. What is a sovereignty goddess? The sovereignty goddess was a concept in Celtic society that was a goddess that the kings of various lands would metaphorically or ceremonially marry to confer the king's rulership of that land. This is tied to the concept of the divine right of kings that can be seen throughout many other cultures as well. A famous example, or at least a famous example in Ireland, is Queen Maeve of Connacht, one of the main characters in the ancient book Antoine Bo Cuiline, or just Antoine. She's listed as having many husbands. This can be confusing until you realize that many of these were real kings who symbolically married Maeve to confer their rulership of the province of Connacht. Maeve's daughter, Gwynevere, is also considered a sovereignty goddess of the same type, so I'm going to look at how the idea of sovereignty goddesses might have played a role in inspiring some of the original Dark Souls trilogy's plot threads, and how bringing these concepts into the story helps to weave ideas together that were missing a bit of context before. Irish mythology, in a way, reminds me a lot of the storytelling in FromSoft games because context is often missing, and historians and folklorists often have to piece things together using other Celtic cultures as a guide or going off the physical evidence, the relics, the place names, the geography, that kind of thing. This is because there was a near millennium-long campaign to erase our culture, language, and mythology that I'm not going to go into now because, it's literally 900 years long. But reading about Irish mythology, you notice that the gods and goddesses often change names and split and join at weird intersections. And of course, there's this inescapable feeling of sadness to everything, of loss. And in Irish mythology, there's a concept where everything is measured in cycles and what was will be again, heroes being reborn and facing conflicts over and over.
Perhaps you've seen it, maybe in a dream, a murky, forgotten land.
In a strange way, this makes the worlds FromSoft creates quite cozy to me. Like they're familiar, like there's something I recognize from my own childhood. It's kind of cozy in the same way that sitting in a bog might be cozy. Deranged, damp, but unmistakably home. So let's start with Gwynevere, the goddess of all things good, known for her calming presence and her fine tracts of land. I believe that Gwynevere, and by extension Fina, draw inspiration from Fina-Gwynevere of Irish legend. Firstly, it's important to note that the Gwynevere of the Arthurian legend, aka King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, has had many, many names, like an unusual amount even for an ancient figure. As listed in the 1999 Arthurian Name Dictionary, everything from Gwynevere to Genevieve to Gainor, Gainer, Fina-Gwynevere, Venur, and Zenebra. Zenebra is Greek, by the way. The modern names Juniper and Gwen both come from it. The Gwynevere who married King Arthur to us is very ancient, but in her story she's not the first Gwynevere by any means. Her confirmed earliest appearances seem to be in the early 12th century. And this Gwynevere generally is portrayed as a human with several other people called Gwynevere existing at the same time as her. Even back then, this seemed to be a common name. The goddess Fina-Gwynevere seems to occupy a much older period, and Historians believe that that name is where the Welsh Gwynevere comes from. So, starting off, Gwynevere is the Welsh for Fina-Gwynevere, or Fina-Gwynevere is the Irish for Gwynevere. Now, I knew this before playing Dark Souls because in my secondary school, that's high school to Americans, there was a girl called Gwynevere. This was the first time I came across this specific name. It's quite old. The girl, Gwynevere, was a really nice person, and she was happy to explain her unusual name. I said, oh, so it's like the female version of Fionn or Finn, one of the heroes of Irish legend. And it's a very commonly used name for boys in Ireland today. She said sort of, yes, but her mother was really big into Irish folklore and mythology, so had picked a lesser used name from it. So she pronounced her name Gwynevere, which made the Gwynevere connection pretty obvious. It can also be pronounced Fina-Gwynevere, and probably some other ways that I haven't heard of, because, again, Ireland is a very small place with a lot of different dialects.
Gwynevere having several names is actually already referenced in-game, although indirectly. Marvelous Chester comes from a Kareem in the far future, and he is known to exclaim, "For Juniper's sake." This is similar to old-timey expressions of
Great Odin's raven!
Juniper comes from the name Gwynevere, and by extension, Gwynevere, and is a type of berry in the real world. Juniper berries are famously used to make gin, which was marketed as a health elixir in the 17th century, due to the old belief that juniper berries cure ailments and aid digestion. Gwynevere's blessings could be a reference to the juniper elixirs in the real world. Also interesting to note is the relief pattern on the ring of favor and protection being some sort of plant, with spiky leaves and berries. This could very well be a juniper symbol, which would represent healing and longevity, and so kind of ties everything together.
Gwynevere, and by extension Gwynevere, actually mean white phantom. I like to think that for Gwynevere this was intentionally chosen as a kind of Easter egg by Miyazaki and his team, as it acts as like a little hint, like if you speak Welsh, it's like, oh, you already know she's an illusion in Anne Orlando, but I could be reading too much into that. Fina-Gwynevere, the Irish goddess, was the daughter of the scheming queen Maeve, and is believed to be a sovereignty goddess, like her mother. The tale goes that her mother Maeve would offer Fina-Gwynevere's hand to various heroes in marriage, all of whom would meet a tragic and bloody end. In the famous story An Táin Bó Cúailnge, or just An Táin, her beauty and charms are said to be the cause of the death of hundreds of men in a war whipped up by her mother Maeve, which I feel is kind of unfair on Gwynevere since she's unaware of any of this, and when she finds out, she feels awful. Forewarned or not, she became known as a faithful beauty for this reason, kind of like the Irish equivalent of a Helen of Troy. This story sounds like it could have been one of the inspirations for the tale of Fina in Dark Souls, right? My personal, headcanon or theory is that Fina is a shortened version of Gwynevere, or she's another aspect of Gwynevere. In Celtic mythology, goddesses would often have several different personas or aspects that could often act independently of the other, very similar to what Marika and Radagon do in Elden Ring, or like Miquella and Saint Trina, those vibes. If Fina is an aspect of Gwynevere, this would explain a little why Lautrec storms Gwynevere's chamber at the end of his quest, other than being just a bit of a bastard in general. It also contextualizes the whole echo of this questline in Ringfinger Leonard's questline in Dark Souls 3. I contend that Lautrec, and by extension Leonard's story, might be based on the myth of Gwynevere, mixed with a folk song called The Lily of the West. This song allegedly started in Ireland, but travelled to many different locations, including America. A man comes to a town, be it Dublin or Glasgow or Louisville, and falls in love with a woman. Also with many names, but in most modern versions she's called Flora, meaning flower. Flora pledges her heart to this man, but it transpires she is out pledging her love to some other rando under a tree as well. This leads the singer to go berserk and stab his rival, which results in him being arrested or killed, or both, depending on the version.
I'm going to use Joan Baez's arrangement since it's one of the most well-known internationally. I stepped up to my rival, my dagger in my hand. I seized him by the collar, and I boldly made him stand. Being mad to desperation, I pierced him in the breast. Oh, for my lovely Flora, the lily of the West.
Well, never expected to see you here. Felt sorry for the poor thing in all her festering glory. And now you want to ravage her soul as well. I sow the seeds, I'll prune the mess. I, Leonard, swear on my vow to the goddess, no one will despoil her soul.
This for me just encapsulates the fight with Leonard in Dark Souls 3. We don't exactly know who Rosaria is, but she's clearly made to be linked to Gwynevere in some way, and Leonard to Lautrec. I have my own theories, but we pretty much know she's somehow related to Gwynevere because she's one of her miracles, just like the dancer. Leonard is called the ring finger, which, indicates a symbolic marriage between the two, if not a legally binding one. And Rosaria was said to give him the Irithyll moon sickle. Likewise, Lautrec was given the Ring of Favour and Protection by Fina prior to Dark Souls 1. This strengthens the idea that Fina is an aspect of Gwynevere, because we end up fighting Leonard in Gwynevere's chamber from Dark Souls 1, just like we did for Lautrec. None of this really makes any sense as a reference unless Fina and Gwynevere are linked concepts within the lore already. It wouldn't make much sense to have Rosaria be a visual reference to Gwynevere and then also randomly be a reference to the Fina plot, unless all these things had some point of connection, right? So, as well, we know Gwyn has a history of giving his daughters away, like physically, just giving them away. Look at Filianor. This is a more overt reference to the concept of sovereignty goddesses. She's literally given as a gift to legitimize the Pygmy kingdom. Or at least that's what the Pygmies were told. Gwynevere is Gwyn's firstborn daughter, and also has the name of a real sovereignty goddess in our world. It's not a huge leap to think that Gwyn might have offered her hand to several suitors as well. Loki lore suggests that the first of these was Seath, and he outlines a lot of text to back that up. This would explain why Seath was stealing her priestesses and doing those experiments on them. I mean, not as an excuse, but as an explanation as to where he had access to all these priestesses anyway. Needless to say, as Seath descended into madness, Gwynevere fled and eventually married the flame god Flan, who we know next to nothing about. But Gwyn is also a flame god, and it was the Age of Fire, so I'm going to guess Flan was a pretty important guy and probably a ruler or a patron god of wherever he was based. Incidentally, Flan is also a name in Irish meaning red. So when playing Dark Souls 3, it seemed pretty clear to me Gwynevere was probably meant to be the Queen of Lothric. Whether she was meant to be the actual Gwynevere is unclear, but she certainly seems to be associated with Gwynevere's role. The Queen of Lothric, from item descriptions, is suggested to be seen by the people as a goddess with the same function as Gwynevere, if she wasn't the same literal person. This and the fact that her daughter Gertrude has one of the Sunlight miracles as well. This is beside the point, but a fun fact about Gertrude is she most likely was named after Saint Gertrude from the 13th century, a nun who was famous for her spiritual writings. When Gertrude was 25, she had the first of a series of visions and began meditating and writing extensively for what she felt was the benefit of the other nuns. She also suffered something called invisible stigmata, which I couldn't get much information on, but it's no secret that Dark Souls 3 takes a lot of inspiration from the weird world of Catholic mysticism. I'd like to pause for a moment to discuss Oceiros. I originally thought this was pronounced Oceiros, so apologies if that's the actual correct pronunciation, but I've only seen people pronounce it Oceiros. The High King of the land or the province would symbolically marry the sovereign goddess in Celtic culture to legitimize him as the rightful heir to the land and title. So it makes sense that this heir to the ones who relit the fire would marry a goddess of sunlight and plenty, as it details in the text. Again, whether that was Gwynevere or a reflection of her, a descendant of hers that took up her mantle, etc. Logically, there probably is no better way to get really good heirs to the fire than by marrying Gwyn's own daughter or Gwyn's own lineage. Oceiros himself is really just covered in mythological nods to the divine right of kings concept in general. In one of the more overt references, he's named after Oceiros, the Egyptian god of life, death, and regeneration. The scholar Geraldine Harris talks about him in her 2004 book on the gods of Egypt and says Oceiros was literally born wearing a crown and was personally chosen to rule Egypt by the sun god Geb. His main myth has to do with essentially being immortal, being killed, resurrected, and ruling over the dead. Oceiros then places his son Horus in the role of the Lord of the Living. Dark Souls Oceiros, or DSL as I lovingly call him, mirrors this completely. Number 1, he wanted to gain the power of Seath, who famously was looking for the key to immortality. Number 2, he did this to ensure his lastborn, Ocelot, was a worthy heir to the fire. Horus, aka the one with the bird head, was the god of kingship, healing, protection of the sun and the sky. I'm using footage from Night Rain because this man also has a bird head, and I am very smart. In the time from prehistoric Egypt to about the Ptolemaic dynasty, or when the Romans came in, the current king would be seen as an embodiment of Horus when he was alive, and when he died, he would transfer to the embodiment of Oceiros. The extent to which this was considered literal seems to fluctuate because this was a very, very, very long time period. These are not called sovereignty deities in the Celtic sense, but it is tied to the same idea of the association with the god conferring the divine right of kings to rule. DSO, Dark Souls Oceiros, as you may recall, is obsessed with his legacy, like King Henry VIII, but with less scout and more dragon stuff. So we can see Miyazaki and his team combining ideas from both of these cultures to create a story of a king seeking double divine right. A double king, if you will. All this legitimizes him, sure, but it also ties him to this disastrous fate. Also like Double King. He falls victim to the same madness Seath did, with all the subtlety of a pack of wolves falling on your head when you're minding your own business in Elden Ring. If Dark Souls is about cycles, then you can see Gwynevere as this goddess of sunlight. Her ties to bounty and fertility clue you in that she's most like a springtime goddess like Persephone or Breed or Flora from UK Celtic mythology. See, it's all coming back around. Gwynevere arrives. Everything is good. So many great heavenly children are born. It is a time of plenty, a golden age, fertility, but the sun has to set. The spring has to turn to winter, and so she leaves as everything turns to ash, and the cycle begins again. It's really interesting that most myths in the real world take place in a far-off golden age. In Irish mythology, when Uiscin comes back from Tír na nÓg, he sees that centuries have passed, and that the people are tiny and weak. In the Dark Souls games, we don't ever get to play in a golden era. Those are the parts between the games. We always come in when everything is already decaying. In something like Elden Ring, it's less obvious. We're in a tarnished golden age, when things have been getting worse for a while, but the land still feels green and lush in many places. In Dark Souls 1, the myths are memories. In Dark Souls 2, the myths are forgotten. And in Dark Souls 3, the world is this empty, decaying husk, feasted on by maggots and the pus of man. The sun dying is a really common ancient belief about autumn and winter. We play these games in their autumn and winter pretty exclusively, and so Gwynevere, to us as the player, remains a fair phantom, ephemeral, still in our view like the light from a distant star that's long been extinguished but impossible to touch. As Gwynevere becomes ever more faint a phantom, Gwyndolin the moon remains weakly reflecting her light and rising in importance until he is consumed in Dark Souls 3. In many pagan winter solstices, the moon is devoured, leaving the sun to be reborn, indicating the start of a new cycle and a new age. Just taking a break here to say this is not a diss on Gwyndolin. I love Gwyndolin. Gwyndolin did nothing wrong. This is a Gwyndolin nation. Every night I get up and I drink my respect Gwyndolin juice. I am just commenting on the themes of cycles in general. In conclusion, it is my belief that Fina is some aspect of Gwynevere through the story of Fina-Gwynevere, and that Gwynevere's whole thing seems to be she stays for a while everything's good, and then leaves and everything's bad. And you can see that in a microcosm with the Fina legend, and in a macro way with the story of Dark Souls 3 and the Queen of Lothric. I don't know whether Gwynevere and Fina are meant to be the same person. They could be sisters, used to reflect the same theme, although it would be strange that they would have the same name. But Thiollier also seems to be a sovereignty goddess. Queen of Lothric, again, could be a daughter of Gwynevere, or some other relation down the line that takes on the same aspects. Rosaria, most likely, is a descendant, like the Dancer of the Boreal Valley, and her storyline with Ringfinger Leonard suggests that she is also a sovereignty goddess of a type. She's certainly related to the idea of rebirth, so can be seen as a fertility goddess in a way. Gwynevere's role in the Golden Age, this is a dark reflection of it. Maybe. These are all just ideas that I find interesting, and I would love to hear what people do with them, what ideas it sparks for you, what you think of this whole thing. I don't know, I'm just interested in giving you some background information so you can play with it and perhaps you can find your own answers. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, subscribe, and comment about what you think. Please share it with anybody you think might find this interesting, and I will see you very soon. Ihawa, Moladh Don Grian, and as always,
join myself and King as remedy. Together we will devour the very gods.